Well, this is going to be a bit of a change of tone, I have to say. We've spent an awful lot of time today talking about, essentially in the round, benefits with a particular focus on pensions and well-being. But I want to just go up a level and just think for a minute about our whole reward strategy. So there's lots of us in the room that are responsible for reward, not just benefits and pensions. And I think it's important just to maybe take a bit of time to think back to how does this all fit into your wider picture on reward. I don't know how many of you are in the room are wearing one of these type of things, but certainly what I think we've all seen over the last few years is that if you want to get serious, and for those people in my age group, I think there's a huge interest in people getting a bit fitter. It might not quite be a bikini body plan, but it's certainly getting fitter, choosing to have a more healthy lifestyle. And one of those things that means is that in order to do that, you have to make choices. And you have to actually narrow your choices, because you have to make time to go to bed on time, you have to make time not to go and have an enormous dinner, and make time to do exercise. And that's a little bit of what it's like with your reward strategy. So what I want you to think about right now, for the next 20 minutes before I release you to go and get a cup of tea, is just think for a minute about what are the choices that we need to make on our reward strategy. The likelihood is that if you haven't refreshed your reward strategy for the last couple of years, it probably needs a bit of a rethink. There have been so many changes, both legislative and economic, that it's probably time to have a bit of a think about it. And one of the things that I really want to think about, and a couple of other people have started to touch on this, is curating that reward strategy, so really editing it to be meaningful. I looked on a benefit provider's website recently, and they were talking about discounts on 870 retailers, over 5,000 offers in their technology product, hundreds of offers in gyms nationwide. And there was all of this going on. I was just thinking, have we slightly lost the plot here? Have we got to the point where we think more is more is more? And actually, maybe it's time to stop drinking from that fire hydrant of offers and discounts and vouchers, and just think about a glass, there's plenty of for me to choose from up here, a glass of cool water, and just sit down for a minute and think, how can we distinguish ourselves? How can I distinguish my business as an employer from all the other companies around us? I don't know about you, but in my wardrobe, I have a set of work outfits that I regularly wear. Now, I'm not quite at the Steve Jobs level of the black polo neck, but certainly I've tried to find things that really work for me. That may not resonate with you. It may be noise-cancelling headphones that do it for you. But all of us have a nirvana, whether it's a well-cut black trouser or some sort of cycling kit that really matters to you, and you spend time and money on editing it and thinking about it. If you're an employer of choice in this digital age, are you in danger of piling it high and selling it cheap? The 8,500 products in your technology offer discounts on 870 retailers. Is it time to curate it down and to try and think about the things in your organisation's offer, whether that's pensions, benefits, pay itself and bonus plans that really resonate with the talent that you want to attract? What I want to do is concentrate on how you might think about pulling a couple of levers in this session, specifically thinking about your engagement with managers and also thinking about how gender pay can make a difference in your organisation. And for those of you who are wondering what that is, the less mathematically able amongst us, it's the symbol for less equals more, and that's something that I will come back to. So my goal in this session is to help you just think about your reward strategy. So I've come up with a goal, and you may or may not like it. It may be something that resonates with you. So what I've suggested that we think about is developing a curated reward strategy which will attract, retain and engage talent. And you're going to do that by creating a joined up focus on long-term and meaningful changes, and by improving transparency and manager engagement with reward to drive employee retention and connection. Ideally, as reward professionals, all of this leads to less distraction, less noise, and more time to focus on the important stuff. You're probably thinking, what is the important stuff? So let's just think about your organisation for a moment. In terms of the way that your organisation presents itself, at the very macro level, so at the very biggest level, there's an external lens that prospective employees think about you. They look through that lens and look at your reputation. They think about how transparent you are, how fair it would be to work for you, how does it feel? Does it feel equal? Does it feel an organisation where I can get on with my job and get on with my career? On the internal lens side, so when you're moving into actually being an employee for the organisation, or you've been there for some time, it comes down to credibility. Is this organisation authentic? Do we connect with the business purpose? Do the managers and the people who work here really walk the walk? So from my perspective, thinking about the important stuff at the biggest level, at the macro level, is really important to try and work out what do you need to do on your external lens and what do you need to do on your internal lens in order to create this. And then you go on to describe this through the employee deal, which is the roof of the house, and then think about, well, how does that actually come through as a strategy and principle? On my table earlier, when we were doing the round table, we were talking about how some organisations have very diverse workforces. So they might have retail, they might have manufacturing, and then a head office environment. How can you make a reward strategy that works for all of those? Well, you can't. But what you can do is develop some principles that work across the organisation. They might be executed differently. So you might end up with different execution under base pay, variable pay, and so on. But fundamentally, there's some principles that might be about fairness. It might be about how you treat employees, how parental you are versus non-parental. And that can apply to all of your employee group. And we haven't got time today to go through all the detail about how you might explain that in fixed pay and variable pay and all of those sorts of things. But it does suggest that perhaps we spend a moment or two thinking about what are the big things that you can do that would first of all give you a bit more time, and secondly, what you do with that time. I'm going to skip over this, but what we've talked about a bit is using technology in order to deliver some of these step changes. We are mostly here reward people. We love spreadsheets. But the reality is that most managers and most business people don't. They don't get it. They don't understand why it's so difficult for us to find simple information. So one of my messages to you in your reward reboot is to spend some money on a bit of kit, whether it's when you're getting fitter, whether it's getting a Fitbit, or whether it's doing something from a reward point of view that means that you're investing in some technology that enables you to talk with managers rather than having your head down in a spreadsheet. This sort of technology enables you to look at, for example, how many employees are paid above the upper quartile in your organisation, how much does that cost? Could you unwind that over time and divert some of that money to your more uncompetitively paid employees? It allows you to have conversations that are more meaningful, even to sit down with managers and say to them, this is where we are. Let's not get tied up with hearsay and anecdotes and job ads and how much people should be paid. Here's the facts. So as an employer, as a manager and a reward manager, and for you and your team, it just means you've got more time because you're not dealing with all of that noise all the time. You've got more ability to be able to talk about the important stuff and spend less time on the day-to-day firefighting that we all get tied up with. So let's particularly go on to gender pay. Debbie said to me when she asked me to speak, she said, you need to talk a bit about gender pay. It's a real issue that's coming up for people. And within gender pay, I think we can apply this same thing. In order for you to end up with a really clear view on gender pay, you're going to have to do some deep work. In the same way that my fellow presenters today have been talking about really understanding the data, with gender pay, it's really important, if you're going to use it as a lever to drive talent and management in your organisation, to really think about the numbers. And that's why the process, I think, needs to go far beyond the headlines. Imagine flying an airplane. I saw this analogy recently. I thought it was great. You're flying an airplane over a country. You look at a country down through an airplane window, and then someone says to you, can you give me a bit of information about that country? The language, the music they have, the food. What's the culture like? You wouldn't have a clue, would you? And yet that's what you're doing if you've only produced your gender pay headlines. You're taking a snapshot of information and then trying to extrapolate that, a load of information. So our approach has been to really think about how can you dive into that in more detail. Now, I've missed out the bit about doing your numbers because I assume everybody here can work out how to produce their gender pay headlines. And I was interested earlier on that 57% of people in the room felt that their gender pay gap wasn't an issue. It's quite surprising on the basis that the number of clients that we've been working with who have really found that they've got a much bigger number than they hoped they had. So it's interesting that this group don't feel they have. But once you've got those numbers and you've presented them to the board and the REMCOM, the next question is, okay, so what happens next? And the organisations are concerned about the fact that by publishing those gender pay numbers, it's going to unsettle previously engaged and people in the organisation who felt comfortable about their pay, felt it was fair. But once those numbers start to come out, is it going to unsettle people? Are people going to start asking questions? So the first step to go into a deeper dive is to do a proper equal pay audit, where you start to uncover areas of risk and do some mitigation. So how many of you, first of all, how many of you have done your headline numbers? Okay, there's still quite a few people who haven't, but I'm guessing it's because we're right near the end of April and perhaps people haven't pulled their data yet from their payroll. How many of you have done a proper equal pay audit? Again, perhaps about 25%. So there's a lot of people sitting in the organisation who don't know what their risks are. Now, there's some obvious fails. If you haven't got a factor-based job evaluation scheme, you will have a problem if you get a claim. If you don't have good, authentic and robust market benchmarking, you'll have a problem because you won't be able to use either of those as a material defence. So those are your first things to do. It's the first things to think about. But beyond that, when you start looking at things like work, work of equal value, all of those things, doing a proper equal pay audit does give you some numbers and some information to help you be really confident that while you can't remove your risk, you can certainly mitigate it. But then, if we're really thinking about reward managers and HRDs in organisations going further, the next level is going down another level, going into some of that underwater stuff that's much more difficult to perceive from the outside. So I know we all sweat blood over the annual pay review, and a lot of you have just come out of that annual pay review, so you remember freshly how terrible it is. But on top of that, so if your annual pay pot is, I don't know, let's say 2.5%, how much do you spend outside of that through the year on ad hoc promotions, on market rate reviews, on let's pay this bloke a bit more because otherwise he's going to leave, those sorts of conversations? Do any of you know what percent you pay on top of your annual pay review outside on ad hoc reviews? One or two? Trina knows? Okay. That's a figure I'd suggest that you get to, and then split it by gender. Because that's one of the underwater areas. All of the research we've done with clients shows that of that pot, regardless of the gender pot split, male, female, about 75% of that pot goes to men. So straight away, you've got lots and lots of ad hoc decisions being made that are driving your gender pay gap wider over a period of time. Let's also think about performance scores. So we quite commonly review performance scores and we look at how fair they are. But do you compare the gender of departments? So for example, IT, often quite a male-dominated department. How do the performance scores in IT stack up against, say, customer relations, which is often female-dominated? What are those differences like? And often you'll see that in some of those teams, some people often in IT are getting excellent in comparison to their female colleagues in customer services who are getting good. So when you're comparing like for like within the departments, they look okay. But as we've seen today, once you start, the value really comes once you start to do some conjoint analysis, where you're taking two sets of data and putting them together. This sort of information is what will enable you over the next 2 to 3 years to really narrow that gender pay gap. Because actually, where you are now is irrelevant. You know, it really doesn't matter where you are. You publish it, and there's been some great stuff out there. We've seen PwC do some excellent stuff. EasyJet have published their numbers for last year and done some really interesting stuff on explaining how they've got to those numbers and what they're doing about it. So there's some very good narrative examples out there to go and have a look at. But that doesn't matter, because what matters is how attractive is your organisation going to look to senior females in the next 3 or 5 years. And unless you start doing some of this stuff now, you won't be able to make a difference. It will be too late. As someone said to me the other day, you know, we're going to have to find more senior females, and they ain't going to come out of nowhere. So you either improve the talent pipeline or you hire them in. But either way, there will be a scarcity of senior females, and your organisation needs to be attractive to them. And if your gender pay gap isn't moving, they'll go elsewhere. So in terms of some of the issues that we've touched on today, hopefully giving you an insight into how using some really deep analysis can enable you to come back to that edited reward strategy that I was talking about. The detailed research and the emphasis of them being able to develop a plan over years means that instead of running from thing to thing, from more to more to more, to the coalition of chaos that we've all sort of ended up with sometimes in our reward strategy, using the time that you might free up by buying some decent technology enables you to really set your path on important things that will matter in the future, like gender pay. Let me just catch myself up to where I am. So what I'm trying to demonstrate in this brief view, that making a difference in reward is not really about more or louder or bigger. It's about researching the right elements of reward that are of value to value drivers for your organisation. And that doesn't mean they'll be the same as any other organisation. If this year, like me, you've got a Fitbit and you've resolved to do 10,000 steps, what that means is that I focus on making time to make sure I do that, although today I've been rubbish. But generally, I make sure that I do that. And that's the same with reward strategy. It's not going to happen unless you really focus on it and go big and then go into the detail in order to come up with something that really matters. And it's important that you do that in order to have the payback in your organisation to make your organisation stand for something that's real and unique. Less is more. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for that, Deborah. Now, the good news is we've got some questions and we've got a little bit of time to ask them. So that's up the top there. I think we're talking about a very traditional approach here. Is it a case of the tried and tested works? And is it time to dial back a bit on the innovation?
Oh, that's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I have to answer it. Okay.
Sorry.
I think it depends a bit on the organisation. You know, it's really useful to think about what works in different organisations. Part of what I suggest is that very often organisations go perhaps too quickly into a reward strategy. They jump to the solution without really thinking about talking to their employees about what matters. In terms of innovation, there are lots of different ideas out there, but it's like anything, isn't it? If you really find something works for you, then it doesn't really matter whether it's old or new, it just works for you. So my suggestion would be, look at the whole smorgasbord of stuff that's out there, but don't bring it all in. Pick the things that are the ones that are going to really drive a difference in the organisation.
Thank you, that's great. And we've got another, what is the average GPG that you've come across?
This is really interesting because I would say that maybe we've worked with clients who have very big pay gaps, and we have worked with some of the Premiership football clubs, and they have to put the footballers in. So let's not talk about them. But even there, we're talking about producing information that strips those out because they're quite proud of their figures, actually, and they want to publish the real numbers. But I would say with the organisations we work with, which may be a select group of people that are worried about it, the minimum payback gap has been 20%. And we're talking in the main with professional services organisations, media. You know, we don't work a lot with very heavy industry or energy companies. And the highest pay gap we're looking at is over 50%. And that's not in financial services, that's in another type of organisation. So I'm very surprised when so many of you said we don't really have an issue, or maybe your standard of where the issue is higher. If you think for full-time men and full-time women, the pay gap in the country is 9%, how many of you are over that? So not that many. So hands up if you're lower than 9%. On mean, not median. Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Because a lot of companies are looking at median, which is usually better than mean, because it obviously cancels out the high notes. But yeah, so I mean, that's quite interesting that we've got a group of people here that are generally coming in lower. But I think most organisations should be aiming at that 9% for full-time men and full-time women, unless you run organisations that have a lot of part-time females, so care industry, hospitality, retail, and so on.
So, thank you, that's great. Okay, I think we've got time for one more tweet-sized answer to a question here. So is it difficult balancing a reward strategy for who you want to attract with one that retains your existing employees?
Yes. It is. But I think perhaps go back to the principles, work out what your principles are, and then maybe do a different strategy that fits the different groups that you want to deal with.
Okay, thanks.
Lovely.
Succinct answer there. Thank you very much indeed, Deborah. Thank you.